These are African rhythms, passed down to us through ancient spirits. Feel the spirit, a unifying force. Come on, move with the spirit. Stand up, clap your hands. Groove with the rhythms, get down, get off.
Welcome to Africa World Now Project. I'm your host and producer, James Pope. Today, on Frantz Fanon's 100 with Professor Lou Turner. Africa World Now Project is next. Frantz Fanon wrote, "You know the famous, often quoted but less applied dictate, each generation must, out of relative obscurity, discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it." What if we are to intentionally engage this thought by asking, are we on the edge of actually betraying our mission? Have we even discovered it? Moreover, what can we do to fulfill it? How we go about engaging Fanon's work gives rise to the corresponding need to reflect on what is urgent, usable, and instructive about his work, identifying the reason that his work matters and is of political consequence in the current moment. There's a need to be more intentional and critical in identifying what ideas, concepts, and frameworks Fanon offers that are useful, no necessary today. This brings us to the need to deeply engage with and interrogate violence and its uses. Violence is ubiquitous in a capitalist system. This is not a novel assertion, nor is it profound. It is not meant to be. This assertion is a call to attention, to bring to the fore, to center, and call for a sober analysis of its deeply embedded presence that has in the past 25 plus years or so begun to remove its mask. It is an invocation to pay attention to its material and non-materiality as the vital life force of capitalist logic that has moved humanity to planetary crises, where multi-billionaires are moving closer to trillionaires and class boundaries have been redrawn in some ways and obliterated in others. Violence is the preferred tool of a capitalist conceptualization and practice of power at every level of human interaction. What is important to highlight at this moment is that we are simultaneously witnessing the very crisis of capitalist logic. Palestine, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Haiti, Sudan, Africa, Southcom, water crises, climate crises, food systems are being disrupted. Fanon's interrogation of colonial violence is an important framework to understand the salience of structures of oppression and marginalization, the process of othering that is fundamental to the maintenance of the colonial project, that primary appendage of capitalist logic. However, we are at a conjuncture, a tipping point, where the logic of capital is feeding on itself. In this process of dying, it intends to take humanity with it. The most vulnerable are its intended first casualties. It is the fundamental contradictions innate to the political, social, cultural, legal, economic logic of modernity. It is indeed a hydra, a bloodsucker, as Malik Shabazz once argued. We must not despair. In the fits and spurts of the inevitable new world forcing its way through, understanding conjuncture provides an opportunity to further pull on the factors of modernity and its contradictions. No site of conjuncture has been as clear a place for contestation than in the realm of knowledge production and access. Fanon's thought opens space and calls for the necessity to link the role of knowledge production to critical consciousness formation, not for the sake of recreating divisions that mirror the colonial logic of capital, but for the sake of confronting the violence that capitalism inculcates in every structure of society. Sites of knowledge production and accumulation include the workplace, homes and families, schools, media, museums, cultural production, the arts, the basketball court, the park, film and theater, etc. Education is about everything: knowledge, power, curriculum, and instruction, a coming to know, the how, the for what, and to what ends should we act in the world. To not understand that all education has political ends is missing the opportunity to identifying important sites of contestation as well as knowing where consciousness, specifically a false consciousness, flourishes. Understanding this requires a holistic approach that extends beyond sites of capitalist incubators or normative educational institutions. Sites of knowledge production are about the power to define oneself, to construct, validate, and legitimize knowledge, and learn what is acceptable and not. It is about values, ideas, practices, as well as identities, race, class, gender, sexuality, disability, etc., and how they link to knowledge production and social processes. Education is a power-saturated discussion. This is why critical knowledge formation, the practice to push the boundaries of knowledge produced within capitalist social reproductive forces, innately ruptures the historical master narratives as deposited through colonial logic and limited conceptualizations of what it means to be human. Fanon's primary question is still with us today, which asks, how do we truly extricate, run away from, remove ourselves? The challenge here lies with finding ways through which all learners can develop ways of knowing that allows for the transformation of their geosocial spaces. Fanon's writing on political conflict, rebellion, and revolution in Africa, and his theses on violence and its relationship between knowledge production and liberation, always paying attention to the practice of theory and a theory of practice, becomes essential lessons to draw upon. For instance, how can we think collectively about the way Frantz Fanon's writings become understood contemporarily? What are the insights for social change from working with the revolutionary thought of Fanon can be extrapolated? Again, knowledge production is a power-saturated discussion. There's more to power than insisting that in power-saturated situations all the relations are in concert with each other and are co-productive of social effects. There are emotional, spiritual, and psychological, as well as material and political attachments to power and privilege, i.e., whiteness and the attachments to purity, innocence, reason, objectivity, and rationality. Power is not the same everywhere, as Bell Hooks once noted. Such imposition of sameness is a provocation that terrorizes. Staying within the continuity of the terms of engagement outlined at the outset of this framework that is presented here, we are ultimately asking, where can we or should we cultivate our critical praxis to ensure that we maintain our ethical and moral commitment to discovering and fulfilling our mission? The answer is where it has always been, in the dialectic of the consciousness and unconsciousness of the working class. This is where Fanon's use of the dialectic comes in handy. Note his exploration of the peasants, the bourgeoisie, and the working class of the colonial world. In the process of Europe's change from a traditional to a modern society, the bourgeoisie were identified as a class to be revolutionized or conscientized, a discussion that can and should be re-engaged for sure today. Yet for Fanon, the colonial bourgeoisie is, quote, absolutely worthless. Fanon writes that in underdeveloped countries, there exists no true bourgeois capable of creating the conditions necessary for the development of a large-scale proletariat, to mechanize agriculture, and finally to make possible the existence of an authentic national culture. This means that since national capitalist development cannot occur, the colonial capitalist pattern of appropriate revolutionary strategies must be very different from those in developed countries. Almacar Cabral's praxis takes us down a slightly different path, or at the very least adds an important intervention on this question, and that is the notion that he presents of class suicide. As for the working class in the colonial context, Fanon goes on to write, in the colonial territories, the proletariat is the nucleus of the colonized population, which has been most pampered by the colonial regime. The embryonic proletariat of the towns is in a comparatively privileged position. In the capitalist countries, the working class has nothing to lose, while in the colonial countries, the working class has everything to lose. As for the true revolutionary force, then, Fanon places his faith in the dispossessed rural peasants in the cities, the lumpen proletariat, and on the masses of the peasantry left behind. He writes, the rebellion which began in the country districts will filter into the towns through that faction of the peasant population which is blocked on the outer fringes of the urban centers. that fraction which has not yet found a bone to gnaw on in the colonial world. For Fanon, revolution was part of the process of the regeneration of the human and society, of self-liberation and rebirth. Only through revolution could a suppressed people undo the effects of colonialization. It is through the actual struggle that liberation would come, restoring integrity and pride, as well as the past and the future. True liberation is not that pseudo-independence in which ministers have a limited responsibility to hobnob with an economy dominated by a colonial past. Liberation is the total destruction of the colonial system. The oppressed must bring all their resources into play because the struggle is at once total and absolute. Fanon was not overly concerned with the details of making a revolution. He was more interested in encouraging their occurrence. Analysis for the sake of analysis was for intellectuals. Fanon wrote to arouse, to anger, to warn against the dangers of exploitation. But he did expect the African Revolution to proceed along two stages. First, there will be a period of physical struggle during which a national program has to emerge to act as a unifying element in order to achieve independence. Secondly, after independence, the energies of the revolutionists must be directed into building a socialist state. Fanon did not encourage a chauvinistic type of nationalism because as a Pan-Africanist, he recognized that it was necessary to hold a people together. He did favor a nationalism based on the genuineness and individuality of the indigenous culture, which would in turn unite with other anti-colonial and socialist movements. Such a nationalism, however, has proved elusive, but the embryonic stages are very clear and very promising in our present moment. Today, in recognition of Frantz Fanon's 100th, we are in conversation with Professor Lou Turner, where we think a bit more deeply about this and other things. Professor Lou Turner is Clinical Assistant Professor in the Department of Urban and Regional Planning at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and former academic advisor for the Department of African American Studies. Lou Turner was Research and Public Policy Director for Chicago Southside Community Organization Developing Communities Project. He is a board member of the African American Leadership and Policy Institute and principal investigator for the Hal Barron Digital Archive Research and Publication Project. He is a colleague of the late Hegelian Marxist philosopher Raya Dunyevaskaya and has written extensively on Fanonian, Marxian, and Hegelian dialectics. With Dr. Helen Neville, Professor Turner co-edited Frantz Fanon's Psychotherapeutic Approaches to Clinical Work, practicing internationally with marginalized communities. Professor Turner is also co-author of Frantz Fanon, Soweto, and American Black Thought, which circulated in the anti-apartheid underground of the Black consciousness movement in South Africa. Our show was produced today in solidarity with the Native, Indigenous, African, and Afro-descendant communities at Standing Rock, Venezuela, Corporation Jackson in Jackson, Mississippi, Brazil, the Avalon Village in Detroit, Colombia, Kenya, Palestine, South Africa, Ghana, Haiti, and other places who are fighting for the protection of our land for the benefit of all peoples. Listen intently, think critically, act accordingly. Thank you for taking the time to join us today, Professor Turner, for this robust conversation, timely conversation, given that this is the 100th year of Frantz Fanon. And of course, this 1925 also had Patrice Lumumba and Malcolm X, El Haj Malik Al-Shabazz, who was born in this year as well. So we want to make sure we're looking at, the full range of socio-political thought, praxis, and behavior for this particular year. But for our conversation, we want to kind of center Fanon. And of course, if we want to branch out into the continuities of Malcolm and Lumumba, we definitely can do that. But thank you for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So just to dive right into the conversation, Frantz Fanon, of course, is one of the important radical revolutionary intellectuals that informed a generation, Black Power generation, generations of African liberation leaders across the African world. And of course, there are people who love to kind of quote Fanon out of context. There's ideas that there's this notion that, people like to just take little bits and pieces like biblical scriptures a lot of times and use them for their means. But, we're in a very interesting moment, right? We're in a moment that we are witnessing capitalism on a global scale, as we've seen it in iterations and historical instances before, but we're seeing it crumble. We're seeing it fracture. We're seeing it in real time around us. And this is a broad conversation. This is a broad question. But Frantz Fanon, how do we understand the praxis, or particularly the intellectual processes or the intellectual foundation of Fanon in this particular moment? Understanding that we can't transmit one moment to the other moment, right? There's no neat, continuity. But what are some of the continuities? How can Fanon or Frantz Fanon's intellectual work and revolutionary work provide some type of understanding of our moment as we are trying to figure out ourselves what to do as organizers and thinkers and intellectuals and teachers, community workers, what to do? How do we understand Fanon in this moment?
When I co-authored Frantz Fanon's Soweto and American Black Thought back in 1978, then we came out with a new edition in 1986, an expanded one. He called the chapter on Fanon, Frantz Fanon, World Revolutionary. And I think that has been both proven out then when we did it. In fact, the original pamphlet was going to be on Frantz Fanon and American Black Thought. And then Soweto happened in 1976 in South Africa. And we discovered the Black consciousness movement and Steve Biko, and who read Fanon and took a somewhat different take on Fanon than we did in the Black consciousness movement, although there was overlap between the origins of the Black consciousness movement in the early 70s and the Black Power movement in the United States. Whereas the Black Power movement was taking much from Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, the Black consciousness movement in South Africa was taking a lot from Black Skin, White Mask on the question of the development and the problems in the development of revolutionary consciousness that Fanon was tackling in Black Skin, White Mask. So the idea of Fanon as world revolutionary began with that moment, that this new generation of revolutionaries, the social movement in South Africa, which Fanon also wrote about in Wretched of the Earth, had come alive. And it was the Black conscious movement and the development of the civics, a new community form or movement centers in South Africa, the civics, which brought down the apartheid government. It wasn't the ANC that brought down the apartheid government. It was really the movement that began with the Black consciousness movement. And as the Black conscious movement expanded with new social formations at the civil society level, aided even what Thabo Mbeki, who was in the leadership of the ANC, recognized that the civics had made South Africa ungovernable, that dual power had been created between the apartheid government and the movement on the ground. So there was also a military engagement of the South African Defense Forces in Angola, and they were defeated. It's the first time that the white South African Defense Forces have been defeated, and it was through the contribution of military from Cuba in supporting the Angolan liberation struggle that brought about the defeat of the South African Defense Force, and that drove them, along with the civics, to the negotiating table in Dakar to negotiate the release of Mandela and elections, one man, one vote, one person, one vote. So it was a series of developments, the dialectic of which one could find in one way or another in the writings of Frantz Fanon. So that first global moment of Fanon, and that's not even talking about Fanon's significance in the Black Power movement. I think Bobby Seale says he read that 1965 Grove Press edition of Wretched of the Earth, first English translation of Wretched of the Earth, 6 times before he turned it on to Huey and whatnot. So, and it got caught up in the whole debate within the civil rights movement over violence versus nonviolence as well, which was happening. By the way, I found an interesting, I think you may have heard this, I forget whether I mentioned it before on another program, that I found this talk, Martin Luther King, in 1967, year before he was assassinated. It's a talk he gave at the American Psychological Association entitled "The Role of the Social Scientist in the Freedom Movement Today." And it's clear he had changed his view on urban insurrections, on urban rebellions. Before, he had been critical of them. He understood them, but he had been critical of them. But in this time, 1967, he was very much less than critical of them. He was really trying to comprehend the phenomenon and understanding it very much from the point of view of white supremacy and internal colonialism. And I got to believe, and I think if somebody did a really close reading of his speech, which is an incredible speech, and Fanon, that King may have read that 1965 Grove Press edition of Wretched of the Earth as well. I don't know that to be sure, but I know that there was a change in his view of urban rebellions in the United States. So both in South Africa, in the United States, Fanon was a world revolutionary. In a number of other parts of the world, people were discovering Fanon. And so you fast forward to the George Floyd Black Lives Matter moment, and you see Fanon all over in public art because of George Floyd's dying words, "I can't breathe." And Fanon has the same comment in Black Skin, White Mask. And people caught that, and it went viral. I mean, it really became a meme of the Black Lives Matter movement. And where Fanon says, "We don't revolt for any particular culture, but simply because we can no longer breathe." And being a Fanon scholar, I went back and found out the real context of which he was talking about that, where the phrase comes from. And he's actually talking about the Vietnamese who were fighting the French. Now, Black Skin, White Mask was published in 1952. The Vietnamese are engaged in an anti-colonial struggle against France, and they finally defeat France in the spring of 1954. And so, the spring of 1954, the French are defeated at Dien Bien Phu, big battles, spring offensive. They're defeated. One of the first times that a major West European power had been defeated in an anti-colonial struggle was by the Vietnamese in 1954, spring 1954. The months are important. November 1954 is when the Algerian Revolution jumps off, clearly inspired by the defeat of the French by the Vietnamese. And again, it was Fanon's writing about the Vietnamese struggle in Black Skin, White Mask in 1952, where this comment of his, this phrase, this formulation of his comes in. We don't rebel for any particular culture, but simply because we can no longer breathe. And then later, in a book that he writes in 1959, which doesn't get as much play as it should, A Dying Colonialism, which he wrote like in 3 weeks, man. It's like crazy. And by the way, all of Fanon's books are spoken word. He didn't write them, he spoke them. And somebody took it down. But in 1959, he writes A Dying Colonialism, and the question of breathing comes up again. I think it's in the famous chapter 1 of Dying Colonialism entitled Algeria Unveiled, on women in the revolution. And this time he talks about combat breathing. It's a different kind of use of breathing. He says that that colonialism creates in the colonized a combat breathing. There's a whole thing that I deal with in some other areas of my work on Fanon about the role of physiology, psychophysiology actually, in Fanon's work, because he was a psychiatrist and very much on the physiological side of psychiatry. Although he was critical of psychoanalysis, Freudian psychoanalysis, he used some of it, but he was a neuropsychiatrist, very much tied to understanding the connection between the psychological and the physical or physiological. And so the question of the physiology of breathing was very important. I even found a comment in one of the editorials he wrote for the hospital newspaper, the clinic that he worked in I think this is the one in Tunisia. He worked in a hospital in Algeria, and he also worked in a hospital, psychiatric hospital in Tunis, in Tunisia. And his patients and the staff, they created a newspaper, which was part of the therapy that he was engaged in at the time. And in one of the editorials he wrote, it's fascinating. Again, it comes back to the George Floyd moment when George Floyd is calling for his mother as he's being lynched by the police. And Fanon has this beautiful expression about why we call for our mothers in periods of trauma. It's beautiful. I mean, he just captured what was happening to George Floyd. Why do we call for our mothers in moments of trauma? It's quite compelling. But again, Fanon comes alive in the whole Black Lives Matter moment. There's a lot of public art of image of Fanon all over the place in this quote. We rebel because we can no longer breathe. So he came alive all over again in the 21st century.
So, to kind of pull back, because there was a lot of strands of thought that we can pull on, in this and this notion of breathing. Yeah, that was a real one of those moments of conjectures or continuities. Because I'm also thinking specifically about Du Bois thinking about the Negro question and how that evolves to the colonial question. I'm thinking specifically about the continuities of understanding the conditions of people of African descent here in the United States as being a colonial question. So Fanon, by the time you get to the Black Power era, there are these kind of like paper trails, there's breadcrumbs that's kind of left that moves into the Black Power era, where you have Fanon's analysis on the colonial question becoming one of those entry points into extending and expanding folk who are here, and radicals and revolutionary thinkers who are here, linking it to the international, right? So this period that you mentioned, where you have the Black consciousness movement that is happening, same time across the world, you're having, all of these other concurrent movements. You have Black Studies movement. You have all of these instances, and they're kind of converging on this colonial question in the context of South Africa and the context of anti-colonialist movement, but here in the United States. And there's a debate happening, as you mentioned, of how to remove the apparatus of strangling or preventing us to breathe as being the colonial apparatus, right? What was that connecting point, as someone who was, active during that particular time? How was the Black consciousness movement informing a lot of folk who were engaging in struggle, particularly here in the United States? We also know the Black consciousness movement is big in Brazil and other places, but here in the United States, what was that continuity like?
We were attempting to create the continuity in the pamphlet we wrote. I don't think not a lot of people knew anything about the Black consciousness movement in South Africa until 1976, June 16, 1976, Soweto. It was school children, middle school kids, mostly elementary and middle school kids, and high school kids who rebelled against the imposition of Afrikaans as the medium of instruction. Now remember, in Black Skin, White Mask, the first chapter is on language. So I'll leave it to anybody to draw the connection there. But Fanon is looking at language, but here language becomes a site of contestation, of struggle. That's when the world became aware of the Black consciousness movement that had been going on for about 3 years, particularly amongst university students. It was mostly Biko was the head of the South African Students Association or something like that. There had first been a South African students organization that had both Black and white. And then there was the breakaway by the Black South African students to create their own organization. So some of the first organizations of the Black conscious movement were university student organizations. And they were thinking through, and I think this is one of the reasons why it was Black skin, white mass that was most of importance to them, because they had been in, I think it was NUSAS, something, NUSAS, I forget what the thing is, National Union of South African Students. And it had all students of all nationalities. And I think when Biko and his comrades in the university broke away, it was because of some of the very issues that Fanon was dealing with in Black skin, white mass. Now get this is the very interesting part. Fanon writes Black skin, white mass when he's a student. He's a genius. I mean, he's a graduate student when he writes Black skin, white mass. He had also been a veteran of World War II. So, he's going back to school after World War II. And he was first going to study dentistry. He changes over to psychiatry. He leaves Paris and decides to go to University of Lyon to study psychiatry. And that's where he did most of his graduate studies. But I think it's that the fact that it's students, university students, and it's the same thing here with Black Studies movement, and it's the only discipline that comes out of the social movement, by the way, in academia. So there's all these connections, but I think the South African students, the Black South African students, were dealing with some of the questions of Black-white relationships that Fanon is dealing with in Black skin, white mass. And that leads to their breakaway and creating their own organization. But the ideology of Black consciousness had already filtered down to the high school level and to the middle school level. And it was around the issue, which becomes the flashpoint, of language, that the students in elementary, middle, and high school rebel against being taught a slave's language, Afrikaans. That was the flashpoint for Soweto. And that's all Fanon. I mean, Fanon helps you to understand that in very profound ways. And again, first chapter of Black Skin, White Mask is on language and the issues surrounding it. So for the most part, people didn't know about it. There's another side of what they were doing in South Africa that also connects to the United States. But for the most part, there wasn't a lot of connection between the Black Power movement here, Black studies, and Black consciousness. It kind of erupts, becomes internationally recognized with Soweto in 1976. The other side of Black consciousness here and there, and would connect here, is that, and this isn't really known, is that because it was mostly associated with students, it's little known that there was a very strong labor side to it. There was organizing amongst industrial workers and dock workers in Durban, South Africa. And so there were Black consciousness trade unions as well. There was, I think it was a 1973 strike that a lot of Black consciousness radicals were involved in Durban. And I think it was also in the automobile plants. And of course, that connects with the revolutionary union movement in the Black Power movement here, for instance, in Detroit and other places as well. So there's that aspect to it. And that's little studied to this day. Although there is the connection to some of the folks later on who go into the ANC, like Cyril Ramaphosa, who was the head of the Mine Workers Union, but he was originally Black Consciousness. That was originally a Black Consciousness organization. It wasn't affiliated with ANC. It later became so. But that early 19 to mid 1970s period of Black consciousness had students, had labor, had women, the women's movement, and the very same elements we see here in the Black Power movement. But they didn't know anything about each other. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things we were, frankly, I don't know that we even were trying to do it at the beginning. It was just that Soweto erupts while we're writing our pamphlet, and we discovered, mostly through information, through journalism coming out of Canada, about the Black consciousness movement, because we were in Detroit at the time, right across the river from Canada. So it was through those means that we discovered the Black consciousness movement, and the pamphlet later on circulated in the underground in South Africa and the Black consciousness movement, of which I'm very proud. It became part of a discussion or a dialogue. I brought Safs Cooper over on tour. Safs Cooper was one of Biko's closest comrades. He's a psychiatrist even today. He was on the same cell block with Nelson Mandela on Robben Island, and he's actually Indian, and brought a couple of young trade unionists over on tour to the United States. So we were making those connections, and this was in the midst of the development of the anti-apartheid movement as well. But so yeah, there's those kinds of connections. By the way, I was just talking about Fanon on Monday night. There was a talk being given, and I was asked to be a respondent here at the University of Illinois. It's a young Algerian woman at McGill University up in Montreal, and she wrote a book called Colonial Toxicity, and it was about France's nuclear testing in the Algerian Sahara Desert, which began during the revolution from 1960 to 66. Now, Algeria got its independence in 62, but they continued to test. And unfortunately, there's one of the points that Fanon makes that I think you asked, what is his relevance for today? His relevance for today, as far as I'm concerned, man, I'll be very honest with you. I think one of the main areas, I think there are some others, one of the main areas of his relevance is his warning about neocolonialism and neocolonial leaders in the third world. And he was one of the first people even to use the term. But apparently, when Algeria gained its independence, it signed a horrible accord with France, which allowed them to continue to test nuclear bombs in the Sahara Desert for 4 more years after independence. And it's an interesting, and so I said, God, I know that Fanon talked about France's nuclear testing in the Sahara, and I found it. It's interesting. People read things and then they don't read things. It's fascinating to me. The most famous, infamous, whichever you want to call it, chapter of Wretched of the Earth, of course, is chapter 1, concerning violence.
That's right.
And either you got people who are gravitating to it, or you have the liberals who are attacking it and whatnot. But what's missed is there's 2 parts to chapter 1. And the second part is called Violence in the International Context. And that's where he talks about France's nuclear testing in the Sahara and whatnot. And again, it's one of the critiques, neocolonialism. It's in a discussion, and he's understanding the context, he's understanding the forces at play. So it's not like a hard critique, but it's something of critique of what he calls neutralism. And it's something of a critique of the non-aligned movement, and that it's in the context of the Cold War. And so France wants to be a player in the Cold War. And so de Gaulle, who comes to power through a coup, remember, there was a coup against the government in France, which, by the way, was a socialist government. Remember, first 4 years of the Algerian Revolution is against a socialist government in France. Don't get it twisted. And moreover, it is a socialist government in France who carries out the 1947 genocide in Madagascar. 100,000 people are killed. There's a genocidal attack at Sétif in Algeria, where 45,000 people are killed in 1947. This is less than 2 years after World War II. Socialist government. Don't get it twisted. And then there's this coup against that government in 1958 in May. It's called the May Crisis of 1958 because it was actually carried out by the colonials. The colonials and the colonials in Algeria in cahoots with the generals against the French government. They overthrow the government. Sound familiar? And they put in de Gaulle as the president because they feared that the government in France was losing the anti-colonial in the anti-colonial war against Algeria. They had already gotten defeated in Vietnam. So they were already licking their wounds from that. And it sounded like the government of France was ready to come to some agreement about Algerian independence. And the colonials in Algeria, ruling class colonials in Algeria, didn't want that. So they organized with the generals against the government, overthrow the government, and install de Gaulle. Everybody talks about de Gaulle. De Gaulle came to power through a coup. And so one of the first things that de Gaulle does is to start nuclear testing in the Sahara Desert as a way of flexing against the anti-colonial movements in Africa, and certainly in Algeria. And so it begins in 1960. Now it turns here. This is the thing. So Fanon writes about this in this section of chapter 1 that nobody talks about, unfortunately. Everybody says violence, 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 but there's two parts to it. So there's violence in the international context. So he does this. They do the testing. It goes on for a number of years. Then, after 1966, France moves all of its nuclear testing to the South Pacific, to French Polynesia. So that's where they do all of their testing. But all that radioactive sand, I guess that's Starlink that disappeared, Jermaine. All of that radioactive sand, all the radioactive sand in the Sahara, that stuff has been blowing through wind currents for decades all over Europe and the Middle East. So anyway, I was asked to respond to, this woman gave a really nice talk, had a lot of visualizations and animation showing wind currents taking all this radioactive sand from these 6 years of nuclear testing in the Sahara that Fanon actually had written about, and how it was spreading all over Europe and the Middle East.
I wanted to back up just one quick moment, because I think your point about the socialist government, when you mentioned the notion, I want to back up because movements today, particularly from young folk, and I want to couple this with the notion or the idea that you posited just now. It's funny how folk gravitate towards parts and pieces of the writings, particularly of critical and revolutionary and radical thinkers. There's another chapter people don't, register as well, as pitfalls of nationalism as well.
Oh, yeah.
National consciousness, right? So put those together. Just why is that important to talk about? Because people talk about and call for socialism in the context of certain movements. How do we relate those particular components? What Fanon is talking about, pitfalls of national consciousness, those ideas, but also how there's a gravitation towards an incomplete application and reading of particular ideas from our revolutionaries and radical thinkers.
You phrased it very well. I think I like the way you pose the question and the problem that it poses. And chapter 3, Pitfalls of National Consciousness, which I've written a fair amount about. I haven't published a lot of it, but Fanon is writing about the social structure, the social class structure in colonial society. He does that in one way with the chapter on violence. By the way, this is one of my pet peeves on people who critique Fanon. Fanon bookends Wretched of the Earth with violence. First chapter is concerning violence. The very last chapter is on torture. And I'm one of the few people who's written on his case studies on torture because many of his clients had been victims of torture. In a couple of cases, because he was a French civil servant, in a couple of cases, two of his clients were torturers. And he told them, listen, man, you need to get back stateside and get out of here. And one guy did that. He left. The other guy said, no, I just want you to help me to be able to do my job better. You know, so it's crazy. But pitfalls of national consciousness, the thing that I think goes to your point is that Fanon sees the dialectic of the liberation movement, and that in early stages of the movement, there was spontaneous revolts. In fact, chapter 2 is on spontaneity, its strengths and weaknesses and whatnot, and the need for organization to arise out of that. Then it becomes, and there's a lot of lessons here for us all, brother, on this one. Fanon makes a point, one of the points he makes, and this is so true today, is that the radicals in the movement and in the organizations will be used as the tip of the spear. Be aware, brother. But then success is in sight, then they put the radicals aside. Okay. By the way, Marx wrote the same thing in the 18th Brumaire. He wrote about the same phenomenon. He says he says that's why he says never again with the bourgeoisie. After the defeat of the 1848 revolution, because no sooner than the bourgeoisie saw success in sight, then they turned on the radicals in the movement that fought with them. Fanon writes about the same thing. In fact, the 18th Brumaire is one of Fanon's favorite works. He actually mentions it in Black Skin, White Mass in the conclusion. He takes an excerpt from 18th Brumaire. But that's one of the things that Fanon writes about in Pitfalls of National Consciousness, that the radicals in the movement are always marginalized. When success is in sight, although the success was mostly brought about by the radicals. So that's one thing. The second thing is the role of ideology, that revolutionary movements in the third world, anti-colonial movements, are typically nationalist in nature. Says, however, upon independence, and even as you're about to gain independence, you have to move from concerns with nationalist questions to questions of society, of social questions. You have to move to socialism. That is for the reconstruction, the reconstitution of society. Otherwise, you'll end up in a dead end. It says these movements will end up in a dead end if they don't transform from the national stage to the social stage. Okay. Now, a lot of my socialist friends really will say, yeah, that's right. He was right. He's right. But I said, but then I went back and found where he says, however, you can't skip the national stage because that has to do with the creation of a national consciousness. But he says, if you just stay there and you don't move to the social stage of actually transforming, he actually calls it a humanism, fundamental revolutionary humanism. And so, and really at the end, I think in the last chapter, on culture, I think at the end of that, which is another thing that people don't deal with, is Fanon's view of culture and art. He says, our struggle will bring about a nationalism, not of a narrow nationalism, but it's the only way to get to an international consciousness. I'm mangling the quote. I used to be able to click, and I'm getting too old to remember this stuff anymore. But the connection between national and international consciousness becomes very, very important, because he said the collection of essays entitled that were published posthumously for the African Revolution, there was this logbook from a reconnaissance mission that you asked about his praxis. a reconnaissance mission he was carrying out through Mali to find a southern supply route for arms into southern Algeria, actually southwest Algeria, to find a way of bringing arms into the interior of Algeria to arm the movement there. And in the most practical of settings, carrying out this mission, he talks about the problem of African unity. He says, I've been trying to bring the idea of African unity out of the mists of people's minds and actually make it real. But he says the deeper I get into the political circles of the national movements and independent states, the more, she says, this continent will be independent soon. But its greatest danger, and he says, I see it, the more I'm in these circles of the movement, he says the greatest danger to Africa is not the lack of independence, it's the lack of ideology.
Ideology, that's right. That's right.
And, here we are. But I think that's one of the things that I think is going to be important. I co-authored a piece for an African journal, Safundi, I think is the name of it. It's coming out at the end of the year on this topic of Fanon and pitfalls of national consciousness.
Let's stay here. There's two things I want to go to, but I just want to stay here for a moment because, of course, I'm thinking about, when folk read Fanon, there should be a link or a continuity to Cabral as well, particularly around this question of ideology. Could you talk a little bit about, just extend that, because Cabral has a similar but slightly dissimilar approach to this particular question, similar in the context of the role of ideology and moving the context of the movement. But I say dissimilar just as not really in quotes, because it's not really that similar, because there is an attempt to approach the bourgeoisization, I'm making this word up right now, of the movement itself, those leaders. So Cabral introduces us to class suicide. And then, of course, Fanon introduces us to a particular concept of how do we move beyond the white mask, right? This notion of the colonial apparatus that is moving one's particular praxis to align themselves with the very forces that you fought against, right? There's the recolonization, the neo-colonial question that's there as well. Could you talk a little bit about that in that particular space? Because I'm also interested, you know what, let me, I don't want to throw another question out here because my brain, but go ahead, please. Any response to that in any way?
Yeah, there's often been there's a number of connections that people make to Fanon. There's the Paulo Freire connection, there's the Cabral connection, to be sure. I always found it interesting. Now, this is one of the things that, I don't know, it's kind of slid beneath the radar for a long time. It's interesting that both Fanon and Cabral both had a critique of Engels. What the hell is that about? Fanon in chapter 1 of Wretched of the Earth has a critique of Engels' concept of, the concept of violence in history. Engels had in Anti-Düring, he developed a whole theory of violence in history that was connected to the stage of production of a society. And so the higher the stage production, the more advanced, the more the strategy of violence would be operative. And Fanon critiques that in Wretched of the Earth chapter 1, because he was charging Engels with economism. It was too economic determinist. Cabral has a critique, although he doesn't say it's Engels. He just says Marx, Engels, and it's not true of Marx. After Marx dies, a new edition, I don't think it's the Russian edition, because Marx is still alive, the 1882 Russian edition of the Communist Manifesto. He writes the preface to it. But I think it may have been a new German edition, the first German edition of the Communist Manifesto after Marx dies, and I think it's also translated in English. And Marx's famous statement, which he opens the Communist Manifesto after the preamble, which is a specter is haunting Europe, specter of communism. It's a whole thing about specters that I've written about in Marx. But the first line of the text after the preamble is the famous line, all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggle. Engels, now, Communist Manifesto has gone through many, many editions when Marx is alive, so no reason to change that. No sooner than Marx dies, Engels puts a footnote to it. Footnote says all written history. And Cabral takes really sharp exception to it. Now he doesn't, I don't know if he puts together the kind of scholastic thing that this is Engels, not Marx, and it's a footnote after Marx dies that Engels adds to it. But Cabral goes off on this thing and says, this is, essentially an example of Eurocentrism and blah, 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 and which is it, which it is, and what it was trying to say. But that was not Marx's view. And so it's interesting that both Fanon and Cabral have an interesting critique of Marxism. And, Fanon famously says in chapter 1 of Wretched of the Earth that when it comes to the third world, Marxism should always be stretched. I can show you other instances where he actually in the logbook that on his reconnaissance mission, he has a beautiful paragraph on Marx. And he talks about, he says, just as Marx showed with the French Revolution that the middle classes, the bourgeoisie, are the most annexationist, the most imperialist, and whatnot. He says, just as Marx showed, he says, so we see in Africa. So there he's, or he says, as Marx showed us, so well about pre-capitalist societies, which is I'm still trying to figure that out, because Fanon has some very interesting work on Algerian land tenure that sounds like it comes straight out of Marx, but he couldn't have known because Marx's writings on Algeria and pre-capitalist societies hadn't come out yet. I'm not even talking about the Gurdjieffs. So I don't know where he gets, but they're looking at the same thing. This is when Fanon is in Tunis and he's doing Algiers, and he's trying to understand the material basis of the psychopathology of his patients. And so it's very, very Marxist. A real Marxist psychology is Fanon. Much better, by the way, than the Frankfurt School, who's known for that. Fanon has a whole other and a much better take on it. And so he goes and starts trying to understand the land tenure system in Algeria. And I kind of quote side by side Marx's own writings on Algeria. The very last photograph ever taken of Marx, I always mess with people on this. Where's the last photograph? It's a famous photograph of Marx. I think it's 1881 or 1882. He dies in 1883. Last photograph taken of Marx is in Africa, in Algeria. He goes to Algiers for the cure because he's very sick, and his doctor said, well, you need to get into a warm climate. And there's a picture of him. The last picture of him, actually, there's two last pictures. There's one last picture with his beard. Apparently, he got his hair cut. And there's a second picture of him without all the beard and everything. It's very weird looking at it. But the very last two pictures of Karl Marx is in Africa. And he writes letters to his daughters about the Algerians and about Africa and Black Africans and the difference between the Arab Africans and sub-Saharan Africans. Very, very knowledgeable. But he writes stuff about Algeria is very, very similar to Fanon as well. So I don't know, there's two tracks that I think people are on, and I think this generation has the best opportunity to do it. Number one is the old track of how people understood Fanon and revisiting that, what we got right, what we got wrong, what was necessary at a particular moment in the development of our own national consciousness or revolutionary consciousness, and also the limitations of that, to get that right. But then there is this other track, and that is what I call a new Fanon. There was a big book of Fanon's writings that were published. The title of the book is called Frantz Fanon, Alienation and Freedom. It's like more than 800 pages. Yeah,
Yeah, I have.
got it here
Yeah,
on my
it's over here.
desktop.
Yeah.
But it publishes a lot of Fanon's clinical papers. And a matter of fact, it's in the clinical papers that he does this analysis of land tenure, the political economic materiality of the psychopathology of Algerians and whatnot, in which he writes about it in the very way, or in similar ways as Marx had. And it's just kind of, it's very, very fascinating. So there's this whole new Frantz Fanon that this generation has to discover as well. But it's going to have to reckon with the old
Yeah.
image of Frantz Fanon that we have created in the past. Some of, there's a lot of it that is valuable, but a lot of it is, is
But
questionable and is diversionary.
and the conditions, I mean, the conditions have shifted,
Right.
Particularly when we're talking about the introduction of algorithm learning in the context of isolation and alienation, how it moves into, particularly in the young space, where the marriage between social isolation that creates an alienation from one's community for young people and gaming, crypto, all of this particular stuff. You know what I mean? It creates this.
Hey, listen, James, this is crazy. This is really crazy. But in Alienation and Freedom, Fanon gave a series of lectures at Tunis University. A lot of them have to do with technology. Okay? I mean, we have his lectures. Now, check this out. This is crazy. So he gives these lectures in 1959, 1960. And so they're there, his students took down the notes, blah, 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 blah. 3 years later, a guy by the name of Michel Foucault comes to the University of Tunis. His first book, strangely enough, this is postmodernism now, right? Is on the same subject matter as Fanon. Now, it turns out that one of Foucault's mentors was a colleague of Fanon when Fanon was an intern in France at St. Albans Clinic, a guy by the name of Ganguohan. And he's kind of considered one of the early precursors of post-structuralism. But he was Foucault's professor and whatnot. In fact, Foucault wrote the introduction to Ganguohan's collected works and whatnot. So Ganguohan knew Fanon. Fanon cites this guy in Black Skin, White Mask. So it's very curious to me. But his lectures at Tunis had a lot to do with surveillance, technology, high technology at that time, which is automation and whatnot. And it's fascinating. I don't know that anybody's really ever done anything with those writings. The Alienation of Freedom just came out, and what English translation came out in 2018. But
yeah, 20.
There's a lot there that that people. I think this one young woman does stuff on cybernetics. I do work on cybernetics myself, but she wrote a book on, and she does cite Fanon's work on technology and whatnot. So there's that there too.
Yeah. It's funny how there was like, I don't know if we were just kind of leading towards this particular strand of thought of the false narrative that has been created, particularly when folk talk about Marx or critiques of Marx, of not having any, dealing with questions of Africans and dealing with questions of Africa. I don't know, I don't know if we want to just touch on it. You touched on it briefly. I don't know.
Listen, James, let's go right. Let's just go right to it. Yeah. Let's go right to it. What is Fanon's relationship to African Americans?
Right.
What is Marx's relationship to African Americans? In Black Skin, White Mask, Fanon is critical of essentially the Black petty bourgeoisie in a number of the chapters and whatnot. And he writes this next to last chapter, I think it's chapter 7, The Negro in Recognition. The first part is on Adler, the psychologist. The second part of it is on Hegel and Fanon. That is Hegel's master-slave dialectic in the phenomenology of mind. I'm a Hegel scholar, so I bring all that too. And so he's doing all this thing, and he shows the divergence between Hegel's slave and the Black slave. Hegel's essentially dealing with feudalism, the lord and the bondsman. Fanon is essentially say, what happens if you introduce the additive of color into this relationship? And he says it's a different dialectic. And he says instead of the slave finding his liberation through his labor, the black slave turns toward the master for recognition. Okay. And so he develops this whole thing on Hegel. But he has a footnote, and I don't know whether it's even across a footnote. He says, I've been talking about the Negro in the Antilles, in the Caribbean. This does not apply to the Negro in America, because in America, the Negro battles and he is battled. He says he's in a fight and he knows he's in a fight. He has no illusions. So that's his first distinction. Some earlier ones in Black Skin, White Man, but that's one of his sharpest distinctions between blacks in America and blacks in the Caribbean in this case. In chapter 1 of Wretched of the Earth on violence, the famous chapter, he has this thing. He says here, Negroes in America, it's been reported that they're starting gun clubs and whatnot. I tracked it down, man. You know who he's talking about there? When he's writing this, in 1960, there is I tracked down, I think this is what he's referring to. It appeared in newspapers in France, maybe appeared on the TV. I don't know if you had access to TV, but it was a press conference held by Robert Williams down where you are.
Yeah.
Well, Negroes and guns. That was the reference, man. Mm-hmm. And so he's one of the few Caribbean intellectuals who understands the difference between the two. Now, my Caribbean friends might not like it, but then I throw up in their face, well, where's your Fanon Center? And in anywhere in the Caribbean. Where's your Fanon Center anywhere in Africa? He showed me. Fanon has never been at home either in Africa when the leaders came to power, nor in the Caribbean when the black bourgeoisie came to power there. The first home for Frantz Fanon was here in the Black Power movement. I told you before on another talk that I did, maybe that wasn't you, I have it somewhere around here. I probably put them away. The 1965 Grove Press English translation of Fanon went through 15 printings in 1 year. The 1968 that went through 7 printings in 1 year. The 1968, the smaller version, went through 18 printings. 1968, the high point of the 60s, 18 printings in 1 year. It was just being grabbed off the shelf. They had to keep publishing it, republishing it, reprinting it. And I used to collect them just to see how high up the printings would go. But this is in 1 year. And Kathleen Cleaver talked about it. I mean, I think we had a piece in one of the books we had on Fanon. And she's talking about, he says everybody was reading Fanon. And so Fanon's work was just being sold in mass sales to young black people at the time, back in the day. So his first home, mind you, when Wretched of the Earth comes out in French in 1961, it's banned. I mean, I don't know that 100 copies got circulated, but it got banned by de Gaulle in 1961. But it was really the English translation in this really pulp version of it, 2 different versions of it. And they went through multiple printings of his work because black people young people were just pulling it off the shelf and reading. I mean, it's kind of the point I make about the King holiday. King wasn't born in January 15th. He was born in December 1956 in terms of his movement birth in the Montgomery bus boycott. I mean, so, we can look at biological stuff or we can look at social meaning of it. And so Fanon's home is here.
No, I mean, that's an important point. I mean, because there's always, and it seems to be this, I've heard in some spaces that, there's this rising, there should be obviously a continued critique and conversation of how do we utilize, again, ideological tendencies to move closer to freedom, right? This notion of that Fanon and Cabral and others kind of highlight here. I want to...
Oh, by the way, I should make a correction. I think I misspoke. There, and although this is recent, this is in the 2000s, maybe 2016. There was something called Frantz Fanon University in Somaliland. It was
Mm.
started by Hussein Bulhan, who's a Somalian who wrote a very good book on Frantz Fanon. Hussein Bulhan, I think Bulhan taught it in DC at some point. Also in South Africa, amongst the Shack Dwellers movement has embraced Fanon, and they have a Frantz Fanon center as well. And they also have connections to essentially Shack Dweller movements in Brazil, where Fanon's work is also read. So again, as a world revolutionary, and there are those two instances on the African continent.
No, I'm glad you made that point because I mean you're talking about, as I know about the shack dwellers movement, the land movement, particularly in Brazil and its connection to,
Right.
South Africa. We've done some work on it and have been trying to kind of extend some of that work and talk to, folk that are on the ground there as well. There's three categories of thinking in the context of our conversation that I want to at least hint on. We may not be able to because I want to honor your time. And we definitely would be, if we need to do a part two or part three, I will definitely reach out to you because there's so much here. And there's three categories and we don't have to do them all, but I do want you, to give it some perspective on it. And one of them is on your political, education, your development. You mentioned Detroit. And I think Detroit, particularly in the context of the Black consciousness movement, and also knowing some young Kenyan revolutionaries who were in Detroit, moving back and forth as well. Detroit seems to be a place that really helped extend, some of the advanced thinking on revolutionary thought. I mean, I know, for you, you're engaged. If I'm not mistaken, the Johnson Force tendency.
Mhm.
Could you talk a little bit about that environment, that intellectual environment that are producing, folks such as yourself and the cadre that you are engaged with that are thinking in this particular way of looking at the Black consciousness movement, looking at technology, looking at all of this, the student movements, working class, the working class perspective as well, seems to be a very important platform for us to be sitting here thinking, still thinking about Fanon, but also what are the contours of thought that Fanon left and the questions that we should be thinking about. So talk about a little bit of your political education, your development itself, the role of Detroit, the role of those strands of thought that were critiquing and also trying to advance grassroots movements that were happening here in the United States, but in particularly around Detroit areas, they're extending outward.
Well, a lot of my practice had to do with working as a journalist for News and Letters, which is a newspaper that's associated with philosophy of Marxist humanism. That Marxism is a humanism. In fact, not to get too much into the weeds, frankly, that's the only name that Marx ever gave his theory. He called it a thoroughgoing naturalism or humanism. It was Engels who called it historical materialism. It was the Russian uh, Marxist philosopher Plekhanov who called it dialectical materialism. Neither of those were Marxist terms for it. But Marx called it in 1844, it's called his Humanist Essays, a thoroughgoing naturalism or humanism. And so associated with Raya Dunayevskaya was part of originally the Johnson Forest tendency. She was Forrest of the Johnson Forest tendency. Johnson was C.L.R. James, and then also included Grace Lee of Grace Lee Boggs. Those are the three leaders of it. But they split. Raya creates News and Letters in 1955, but in doing so creates a workers' newspaper with a worker as the editor of the newspaper, a real worker, not a 24-day wonder of a radical goes in the plant. Charles Denby had been a sharecropper in Lowndes County, Alabama. So, Bloody Lowndes, he comes out of that, came up at the Great Migration to Detroit. Having lived in Chicago, having also lived in Los Angeles, you can actually follow the streams. Chicago, everybody in Chicago comes from Mississippi. Everybody in Detroit comes from Alabama. A lot of people in California come from Texas and Louisiana and whatnot. And so you have to understand those distinct regions within it. And so part of a very significant part of my practice was talking with workers. We had a workers' newspaper in which workers wrote their own articles. And we as intellectuals help them write their article. We don't write them for them, but we're getting we're getting information from inside the plant at the point of production. But you can only do that and understand what you're doing if you know if you know Capital by Marx. I mean, so you can write some nice stories down, and that's cool. I heard a young woman last week who's a photographer talking about interviewing and taking photographs of workers, and it's already the same thing. I mean, it was just like taking stories, but these. I mean, the whole point what Marx was saying is that you understand capital. Now, you can understand capital scholastically or analytically, but to be sure, actually, he does that. But you have to understand capital through the subjectivity of the worker, through the subjectivity of labor and whatnot. And the consciousness of labor. Can't keep talk about class consciousness, if you don't practice it in terms of that of labor. And so that's what I try to convey to students that I work with here as well. The thing that I would say for those academy who are looking at Fanon is what Fanon does himself as an intellectual, as an academic, as a social scientist. By the way, Fanon also had a degree in sociology, which people aren't aware of. And so sociology plays a very important part, as well as obviously having a graduate degree in psychiatry. Fanon conducts an interesting experiment on a Muslim men's ward. This is one of the clinical papers. And the experiment fails. I call it Fanon's creative failure. I think he knew it was going to fail. This is during the time of French colonialism, in that he creates a social therapy, as it is called, on that Muslim men's ward, but it's filled with things from essentially French colonial culture. It fails. Now, Mitterrand, who was the home secretary for the French, later becomes president of France, was the one who infamously says that Algeria is France, that we're not giving it up. Algeria, remember, Mitterrand is a socialist. He's the one who says Algeria is France. We're one and the same. And so Fanon essentially tests that by putting French culture on this Muslim men's ward, and the damn thing fails. This is what sends him to study Algerian land tenure. Now, the story doesn't end there. An intern, I think she's still alive, Alice Cherky, writes a very nice book on Fanon. And she was an intern of Fanon's in the psychiatric hospital in Algeria. And she says, I think it was either a husband or another colleague asked Fanon about the failure of his experiment. And Fanon says this famous, in fact, I use it as the title of one of my articles. He says, psychiatry has to be political. So I don't give a damn what you're doing as a social scientist. I mean, you can be in psychology, you can be economics, you can be in, obviously political science, you can be whatever and whatnot. It has to be political. If you're a progressive person, if you're a radical person, and that's the attitude he had. Now, this guy had achieved the height of French society in the social sciences. Not only was a psychiatrist in France, if you're a psychiatrist, you also have to be a surgeon. He was a surgeon as well as a psychiatrist, and he was the head of a whole hospital. And one of the biggest mental health hospitals in the third world, in Africa. Now, he could have thrown it all away and went, like so many do. But he ended up, joining the revolution. And he injured revolutionaries from the FLN would come in at night, he'd smuggle them in, and he practiced surgery on them. He would aid them in fixing their wounds and practicing surgery on them to get them well. So he had a whole underground relationship to it. So he says psychiatry has to be political. And I would say social science. I mean, King was essentially saying the same thing, the role of the social scientist in the freedom movement. And I think now, sometimes, that becomes a choice. Other times, like now, it's foisted upon you. You're going to have to be political now. in matter of fact, you can't slip and slide on it. I mean,
Mm,
it's out for everybody to see whether what you're going to do or what you're not going to do.
mm,
So sometimes you find it, other times like now it finds you. And so I think the example of Fanon is very much current for the day. He chose to be political. And again, it's kind of frankly easier for us. You're going to have to be political in this
mm,
climate. I,
mm,
I think it was he had to be too. I mean, he saw this revolution right before him. He was experiencing it, so it compelled him to do. Psychiatry has to be political. He can't be this and that and some kind of false
mm.
neutrality or even-handedness or bothisms and that kind of BS. And so I think, to me, that's one of the things. Yes, the youth, I do that all the time, and we all do that. But I'm more concerned, as what Marx says. I forget, there's 11 theses on Feuerbach. I forget which one it was, the seventh or the fifth. He says the educators have to be educated first.
Mm,
And I think I'm talking about the educators. I'm talking
mm,
about the social scientists and frankly, even the natural scientists, so far as I'm concerned. We're talking about environmentalism and things like that.
mm.
A lot of that's natural science. It's got to be political, and it's all coming at us. I mean, I think everybody got distracted by all the shiny things that Trump puts out there, but this thing with the tariffs,
Mm.
back up on them coronas, brother.
Yeah,
but
your rice and beans.
I think I think it's somehow taking out. I mean, it's clearly. I think the guy who was the head of the former head of NATO, he says he says he says no, it's former head of the EU. He says Trump is the biggest enemy of the global economy. He's taking it there. Uh, uh, and I think he's right.
Yeah,
And for capitalism is coming. It's being exposed all over the place.
yeah,
So, but I
yeah.
think it's the educators have to be educated first because they're going to have a lot of young people in front of them, and I'm very concerned about what they're going to be saying to them, and
Yeah.
because I keep hearing all the time I'm on Zoom calls or some, yeah, students came, they asked me advice on this. I said, well, I'm kind of wondering what you tell them and whatnot. So again, it has to be political, which is
No,
I think your area, right?
yeah, no, absolutely. And which it brings me to I want to at least broach this last category just because I want to honor your time. It's getting, and again, I'm going to, reach back out, as we can do something else because there's two other things that I know it can take at least an hour. I wrote
Yeah.
them down that we do, but I do want to, as we pause our conversation, to comment particularly on your last offering of your thought in the relationship of Fanon and Black studies, this notion of being political. Because again, as someone who has one foot in the academy and one foot out of the academy, really attempting to ground myself out, in working class perspectives and that practice, right? Making sure just to comment on link what you just said to the role and responsibility in this particular moment of Black studies or Africana studies, if you will, and how Fanon can actually provide a important entry point into making sure the Black studies is political, which I've written a critique of, one of it's been depoliticized and there's folks studying the revolutionary potential of icing on cakes. I mean, all of this stuff is just becomes, what I mean? It just becomes
Yeah.
this very, very, non substantive, and I'm all good for theory. I mean, that's one of my I try to think about, but the practical application of your theory and what it looks like in our communities, and then go back and assess. It's this process. So could you make just to tie with your last comment, this notion of the social sciences, the natural sciences, the sciences, and the way that we study, experiences in this moment? Because, like you said, pack up, get your Coronas, get your beans and rice, you know how does this look in a practical sense, particularly as Black studies, as you importantly point out, was born out of social movement. It was born
Right.
out of the struggles not just in one particular period, but a continuation, a genealogy of struggles of us, of people of African and people of African descent, attempting to deconstruct, refuse chattel slavery, Jim Crow, so on and so forth. So how does Fanon, in the context, help Black studies stay political?
I'll enter it from the point of view of the student. I used to be academic advisor for the Department of African American Studies here at the University of Illinois. I helped turn the African American Studies program into an African American degree granting department. We almost had a PhD, but that's a whole other story. But I was academic advisor. I was also an instructor, and I was also a curriculum coordinator for African American Studies. In fact, I'm supposed to be co-writing a book, a new introduction to African American, we call it critical African American studies. Enter it from the point of view of the students. Anytime students would come to me as an advisor, as an academic advisor, first of all, let me say that I had 67 majors in African American studies. These are Black students mostly who were majors in African American studies. Moreover, they were double majors. So this was the best, okay? Because they got to deal with their parents and stuff about, blah, that kind of stuff. But these were double majors. I had the largest number of Black majors in any department in any state-funded university or institution in the state of Illinois. I helped build that, okay? Anytime students came, I said, so what do you want to do when you're done? That was part of my intake. What do you want to do when you're I don't have to tell you, James, I was really taking, they had taken a few class or two. I used to teach intro, some other courses as well in the arts and culture and literature. And so, they've been around a little bit, but and I would say 95%, and this is not an exaggeration, 95% of those students, and not just the ones who were majors, but who came for advice on courses to take, said they wanted to return to their community work. 95%. And that's not an exaggeration. Please believe me. In fact, I started wondering why they all keep saying it. And so that's one of the things. And to me, that's one of the very important things that African American studies instills in students. But what's the definition of the problem? I used to teach policy science. How do you define the problem? What is the problem definition? The problem definition is this. We're caught in a contradiction. And while it is altogether true and cool, but what do we tell young people? I don't care whether you're a parent or a relative or whatever, get a good education. That's our thing. They're socialized from elementary school, get a good education. What is the consequence of that for the Black community? The consequence of that is a brain drain. Because they get up and they get out. They don't return. So then you look around on the Black community. I won't say it's just that. It's obviously capitalism. But we're essentially fostering a brain drain. And so African American studies redirects that. And I consider that a moral imperative of African American studies. Now, students, when I say that 95% of these students who would come to me and I'd ask them that question would say they want to return to their community, they get that. But they weren't getting any advice from any of their professors. They weren't getting it from me. I was simply asking the question. That's what they were hitting me back with. So again, we have to look at if African American studies comes out of a social movement, comes out of a movement of bridging the gap between campus and community, which is another aspect of where African American studies comes from. I think we have to be really serious and deliberative about that. And again, this is what students on their own were making of African American studies. And I've always been taken by that. And I think it's something that academics should appreciate, both the problem, the contradiction, and how students, at least in my experience, are seeing it. But I think it's a question to ask students. What do you want to do afterwards? I mean, just to kind of test it out. I mean, what do you want to do afterwards? And again, they could be blowing air up my pants or something and just telling me what I think, they think I want to hear. I don't think it was that, but African American studies. Actually, it was Raya who taught me this when I was living in Detroit. You asked about Detroit because I was pretty critical about Black studies back in the day. Harold Cruz was at Ann Arbor, the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor, and I used to go visit him sometime or see him at conferences. I actually had lunch. Brian and I had lunch with him one day. He was real nice and whatnot, but we had differences. But he had some interesting stories about stuff people back in the day. But she taught me that she was African American studies. I don't know if she said this like this, but the import of it is could be really the salvation of the Black community. But she's the one who told me, darling, you need to take this seriously. She's like, I know you have a critique. And so I think the students were showing me stuff that I was just incredible. I mean, I learned a lot from them. But the educators have to be educated first. The thing is, educated with what? And I do philosophy. So theory is very uppermost in my mind. But I'm also, I do practice too. I practical stuff that I'm involved in over the years. But I think what Marx said in his dissertation, the practice of philosophy is theoretical. Fool around with that.
Yeah.
And I'm really amazed. A lot of the students that I'm talking with, I got a young woman who's doing on fast food workers in Ferguson, Missouri. Mike Brown was killed, and looking at that, a lot of students, both Black, white, Middle Eastern, Latino, Latinx. It's incredible. I mean, a lot of them are very, very active around stuff. This whole thing with Gaza really jumped off. By the way, it'd be important, I think, for a future thing that you're doing to look at Malcolm's trip to Gaza. I just saw something about that recently. Interesting to see. And actually, it was to refugee camps, wasn't it? We should talk about Malcolm sometime in Kenya. I think at the piece that I wrote, that I sent you the reference to, the American Committee on Africa, whatever it is, they had this whole program about bringing African students to the U.S. And Tom Mboya was Kenyan, who was a person that worked with bringing Kenyans to Africa. Actually, I think I made it a conjecture than a real thing. I believe it's the same program that brought Barack's father to America.
I believe it was, yeah.
No,
I just wanted to, again,
but Malcolm was their connection. The students actually met with Malcolm.
Yeah. And it's very interesting. I actually did something with a organization called Black Men Build on Malcolm in Kenya a few weeks ago that we're going to be doing something else on April 17th. And I'll send you that. Hopefully, I'll be in touch with you on that because I would love for you actually to join, so, if you have the opportunity. But no, there are literal 2-3 things that I want to piggyback up with you and extend. But right now, I think, this is a good place to pause. Thank you for taking the time. This has been rich beyond measure. Again, thank you for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now, if you talk about it, it's a show. But if you move about it, then it's